In the Dakota Territory, summer of 1878, a man was digging his family's grave, or so the consensus went. His name was Albrecht Steiner, a German immigrant with quiet hands and eyes that seemed to see through the very soil he was turning. He was not digging a rectangular plot. He was excavating a massive shallow basin, nearly 50 feet long and 20 feet wide, with gently sloping sides. It was the shape of a great, overturned boat. All summer, under the relentless prairie sun, he and his 2 oxen worked, carving this strange wound into the earth while his neighbors built their log cabins tall and square against the sky. They watched him from a distance. They saw him hauling field stones, not logs. They heard the patient chip, chip, chip of his mason's hammer, a sound as foreign as his accent. The whispers started at the trading post, then grew louder at Sunday socials. "He's digging a root cellar to live in," one would say. "It's a tomb," said another, and that was the name that stuck. Steiner's tomb. By autumn, the thing was finished. It was less a house and more a feature of the landscape. A low, stone-ribbed mound of earth with a single stout door and 2 small, deep-set windows. It barely rose above the prairie grass. It looked ancient, stubborn, and utterly insane. What did this quiet stonemason understand about survival that every seasoned pioneer, every experienced carpenter, had missed? The answer would arrive with the deadliest winter in living memory. And to understand what he knew, you first have to understand the terrible physics of the cold they all faced. Hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because this is the story of how a house built from stone and mockery rewrote the rules of survival on the American frontier. The problem in the Dakota Territory was not simply the cold. It was the nature of the cold. It was a living entity, a predator that hunted with wind and time. Winter did not just visit, it laid siege. For 6 months of the year, the land was an iron plate of frozen earth under a sky the color of slate. Temperatures of 20 below zero were common. 40 below was a trial. 50 below was a death sentence. And the wind was its constant accomplice, a relentless, soul-stealing wind that blew unobstructed across hundreds of miles of flat, frozen prairie. It found every crack, every seam, every pinhole in a man's defenses. It didn't just make you feel colder. It actively stripped heat away from any surface, be it skin or wood. The concept of wind chill wasn't a scientific term yet. It was a visceral reality. It was the difference between hardship and a frozen lung. The settlers fought this enemy with the only weapon they knew, the log cabin. It was the architectural icon of the frontier, a symbol of self-reliance and tradition brought over from the forested hills of the American East and the woodlands of Northern Europe. A well-built cabin by a man like Elias Thorne, the settlement's most respected builder, was a work of art. The logs were scribed and fitted with masterful precision, the gaps chinked with a mixture of mud, moss, and animal hair. They were sturdy, handsome structures that spoke of security. But they were failing. They were failing slowly, expensively, and sometimes fatally. The settlers were trapped in a paradox of their own making. The very material they used for shelter was an inefficient barrier against the Dakota cold. Wood is a relatively poor insulator. A solid 10-inch log wall has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of about 10. Modern, poorly insulated walls have a higher rating. This meant that heat poured through the walls and roofs of their cabins. To stay warm, they had to wage a constant, desperate war of combustion. The cast iron stove in the center of the cabin became a ravenous god, demanding a ceaseless tribute of firewood. A family might burn through an entire cord of wood, a tightly stacked pile 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 4 feet high, in less than 2 weeks during a cold snap. This created a brutal economy of labor. A man spent his entire summer and fall cutting, hauling, splitting, and stacking the wood he would need to survive the winter. The forest, once seen as an endless resource, was being pushed back from the settlement at an alarming rate. The journey to find good hardwood grew longer each year. The work was grueling, and a man's ability to swing an axe was directly tied to his family's chances of seeing the spring. Inside the cabins, life was a constant negotiation with the cold. A small perimeter of warmth existed around the stove, a bubble of perhaps 10 feet in diameter. Beyond that bubble, the temperature dropped precipitously. Water buckets a few feet from the roaring fire would freeze solid overnight. Ink froze in its wells. In the mornings, a rime of frost would coat the blankets on the beds, formed from the sleeper's own crystallized breath. Families lived their lives in that small circle of heat. They cooked there, ate there, repaired tools there, and slept as close as they could. The walls were always cold to the touch. The floors were an ice-cold plain that stole warmth through the soles of the thickest boots. There was no escaping it. The conventional wisdom had reached its limit. The log cabin, a design perfected for the milder, forested climates of another continent, was being broken by the sheer thermodynamic violence of the prairie winter. This was the world Albrecht Steiner observed during his first winter. He was not a carpenter, he was a stonemason, the son of a stonemason, from the foothills of the Bavarian Alps. His knowledge was not of wood, but of rock. In his homeland, people built with stone for 1,000 years, not because it was warm, but because it could be made warm. They understood a principle that the woodsman of the frontier had never been forced to learn, the principle of thermal mass. Steiner saw his neighbors fighting a battle of insulation and losing. They were trying to hold back the cold. He knew from generations of experience passed down through his craft that you could not hold the cold back. It was too powerful, too pervasive. The only winning move was not to fight the cold, but to store the heat. He watched them feed their fires, turning precious wood into momentarily warm air that immediately fled through the walls and ceiling. He saw it as a profound waste. It was like trying to carry water in a sieve. His mind did not see a log cabin as a fortress. He saw it as a leak. He knew there was another way, a way that involved working with the earth, not just upon it, a way that used stone not as a cold barrier, but as a warm heart. And so, in the spring of 1878, he ignored the advice of his well-meaning neighbors, took up his shovel, and began to dig. The construction of Steiner's house was a spectacle of quiet, methodical labor that baffled the entire settlement. It began with the pit. He dug down 4 feet below the frost line, ensuring the foundation of his home would rest on earth that never truly froze. This alone was a tremendous amount of work, moving tons of soil with nothing but an ox, a scoop, and his own muscles. Then came the stones. For months, he drove his wagon across the prairie, collecting the field stones left behind by ancient glaciers. He chose them with a mason's eye, seeking flat faces and predictable shapes. He was not building a crude rock wall. He was assembling a massive 3-dimensional puzzle. The walls rose slowly from the earthen basin. They were not solid stone. This was the first detail the onlookers misunderstood. Steiner was building 2 distinct walls, running parallel to each other, about 18 inches apart. The outer wall was thick and rough, built with the largest, most irregular stones, designed to bear the load of the earth that would eventually be pushed against it. The inner wall was finer, made of carefully shaped and fitted stones, with a smooth, almost polished interior face. The cavity between these 2 walls was his secret weapon against the wind. He did not leave it empty. He filled it, layer by layer, with a dense mixture of dry sod, clay, and prairie grass. He tamped it down until it was nearly as hard as brick. He was creating a composite wall over 3 feet thick with an outer layer of stone, a thick core of earthen insulation, and an inner layer of stone. Elias Thorne came to visit one afternoon in late summer. Thorne was a good man, honest and respected. He was the foremost authority on building in the region, and his concern for the Steiner family was genuine. He stood at the edge of the pit, watching Albrecht carefully place a stone on the inner wall. "Albrecht," Thorne began, his voice laced with friendly worry. "I have built 30 cabins in this territory. I know the winters. Stone is a cold material. It draws the heat right out of the air." Steiner paused, wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty hand, and nodded. "It can be," he said simply. Thorne pressed on, pointing with a calloused finger. "That inner wall of yours, it's going to sweat. In the winter, every bit of moisture in your air will turn to frost on that stone. You're building an ice cave for your wife and children. They will be colder in there than in a canvas tent." It was a logical, technically sound objection. It was based on every bit of experience Thorne possessed. Condensation on cold surfaces was a constant plague in the cabins. Steiner simply looked at his wall, then back at Thorne. "The stone will not be cold," he replied. His calm certainty was more maddening to the onlookers than any angry defense would have been. The next innovation was the roof. Steiner did not use log rafters and planking. He began to build arches. Using temporary wooden forms, he laid stones in a curve, creating a vaulted ceiling that was immensely strong. It was the principle of the Roman aqueduct applied to a prairie home. Once the stone arches were in place, he covered them with the same layered system, a thick barrier of sod and clay, effectively pulling the earth up and over the house itself. The final structure was a low, semicircular mound, a stone Quonset hut buried in the prairie. Thorne visited again, this time with a more urgent warning. "The snow, man. That low, curved roof will never shed a heavy snow. The weight will build up until it collapses. A proper steep pitch, that's what you need. That's the only way to keep the weight from crushing you." Again, the objection was sound. The settlers were in a constant battle with snow load, and a steep roof was their primary defense. Steiner looked at the thick, arched stone above him. "It is built to hold a mountain," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "It will hold the snow." But the most important part of the design was completely invisible. Before he laid a single stone for the floor, Steiner built a complex network of channels, like a flattened rectangular maze, running beneath the entire living space. These channels, lined with flat stones, all originated from a single, heavily reinforced chamber at the heart of the house. This was where the stove would sit. The channels then snaked their way under the floor before venting into a massive stone-lined chimney flue built into the thick north wall. He then laid the floor itself. It was not dirt, and it was not wood. It was a solid surface of thick, flat flagstones, carefully fitted together and sealed with lime mortar. The stove would not just sit on the floor, it would be integrated into it. The system was a giant, slow-breathing lung. When the stove was lit, the hot smoke and exhaust gases would not travel directly up a chimney. They would first be drawn down into the network of channels beneath the flagstones. The hot gases would circulate through this entire underfloor labyrinth slowly, before finally exiting through the chimney. The genius was in the transfer of energy. As the hot gases moved through the channels, they would surrender the bulk of their heat not to the outside air, but directly into the immense thermal mass of the flagstone floor and the tons of earth and rock beneath it. The floor itself would become a massive, gentle radiator. The heat would then conduct from the floor into the thick, insulated stone walls. He had built an engine. A thermal engine designed for maximum capture and slow, radiant release. The stove was not for heating the air. The stove was for heating the house. The entire 300-ton structure of stone, clay, and sod was designed to function as a thermal battery, soaking up the energy from a small, efficient fire and then releasing it for hours or even days. By the time the first snows fell, Steiner's tomb was complete. It was an object of communal ridicule. Men at the trading post would joke about it. Heard Albrecht's trying to grow potatoes in his living room. Women would eye Anna Steiner with pity at the church. The children were teased. But through it all, Steiner remained serene. He had not built a house based on what his neighbors believed. He had built it based on what he knew about stone, heat, and time. Now all he had to do was wait for winter to prove him right. The winter of 1878 began much like any other. The cold settled in by late November, and the settlement fell into its familiar rhythm of survival. The saws and axes fell silent, replaced by the constant low roar of the wood stoves and the howl of the wind. By Christmas, the temperature had been hovering near zero for 3 weeks. The settlers were already burning through their wood piles at a concerning rate. In early January, a change occurred. The wind died down. The sky took on a strange, hazy, pearlescent quality. The old-timers looked at it and felt a knot of dread tighten in their stomachs. It was a sign. They called it a breeder sky, a sky that was pregnant with a storm. The temperature began to plummet. It was not a gradual cooling. It was a free fall. At dawn on January 7th, the mercury thermometer outside the trading post read 10 degrees below zero. By noon, it was 22 below. By sunset, it had dropped to 30 below, and the wind had returned, this time with a terrifying, high-pitched scream. The blizzard hit just after dark. It did not arrive as a series of flurries. It struck like a solid wall of white. Visibility dropped to zero. The world vanished, replaced by a churning, horizontal chaos of ice and wind. The settlers, trapped in their cabins, could only listen to the storm's fury and feed their stoves. Inside the log cabins, the battle for warmth became a desperate, guest-losing fight. The wind, now gusting to over 50 miles per hour, was a physical force, pressing against the log walls, seeking every tiny flaw in the chinking. It drove the fine, granular snow into the cabins, not just under the doors, but through the very walls themselves. Families awoke to find small drifts of snow on their floors. The stoves, which had once been sources of comfort, became tyrants. They had to be kept roaring at maximum capacity, their iron sides glowing a dull cherry red. The heat they produced was immediately stolen by the cold. A man would be sweating as he loaded wood into the firebox, while 10 feet away his wife shivered under a pile of blankets. The temperature inside the cabins, even with the fires raging, dropped to 15 degrees, then 10, then to the freezing point itself. Water barrels froze solid. Potatoes stored in the cellars turned to icy rocks. Livestock left in the barns, no matter how well sheltered, began to die, their bodies discovered frozen solid in the morning. The settlers began burning anything they could: fence posts, furniture, precious books brought from the old country. They were burning their past to survive the present. Elias Thorne was experiencing this failure in the most personal way imaginable. He was in his own home, the cabin he considered his masterpiece. He had handpicked every log, scribed every joint with the precision of a watchmaker. By all rights, it should have been the warmest, most secure home in the settlement. It was not. The north wall of his living room was coated in a thick, glittering layer of frost. He could feel a steady, knife-like draft coming from somewhere near the floor, though he could not find its source. His wife and 2 young daughters were huddled together in their bed, buried under every blanket and quilt they owned. The thermometer hanging on the wall opposite the stove read 5 degrees Fahrenheit. 5 degrees. He was burning through his woodpile at a rate that terrified him. The stack that was supposed to last him until March would be gone in a week. He felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the dread of a master craftsman who has discovered his craft is worthless. His expertise, his experience, his entire body of knowledge had failed him. He was a king in a castle of ice, and then a thought intruded, sharp and unwelcome. He thought of Albrecht Steiner. He thought of the low stone mound, the tomb, now buried under a mountain of snow. He pictured the thin, sweating stone walls he had warned against. A profound and terrible guilt washed over him. He had stood by, had participated in the mockery, while a man built a house that was, by all conventional logic, a death trap. What if Steiner's pride, his stubborn refusal to listen, had doomed his family? What if Anna and her 2 small children were in there right now, frozen? The thought became an obsession. He could not sit by his own inadequate fire while another family might be perishing. He had to know. He had to see. Pulling on his heaviest coat, wrapping his face in wool until only his eyes were exposed, Elias Thorne grabbed his lantern, leaned into the door against the force of the wind, and stepped out into the white hell of the blizzard. The journey was only 200 yards, but it was the most harrowing 200 yards of Elias Thorne's life. The wind tore at him, trying to rip the lantern from his grasp. The snow was not falling. It was a horizontal blast of tiny, sharp particles that scoured his exposed skin and instantly froze on his eyelashes. He could not see more than 5 feet in front of him. The world was a screaming white void. He navigated by memory, stumbling through drifts that were already waist-deep. He was guided by a single, terrifying image: the frozen bodies of the Steiner family, victims of a foolish, stubborn idea he had done nothing to prevent. The guilt was a fire in his gut, the only warmth he felt. He almost missed the house entirely. It was just a deeper shadow in the swirling chaos. The low, curved roof had done exactly what Steiner had predicted. It had not shed the snow, it had held it. A massive, insulating blanket of white, 10 feet deep in places, now covered the home, protecting it further from the wind. Only the top of the stone chimney and the dark rectangle of the door were visible. He saw no smoke from the chimney, and his heart sank. A cold fire meant a dead family. He stumbled to the door, his clothes stiff with ice, his beard a solid mass of frozen breath. He raised a gloved fist and hammered on the thick wood. The sound was swallowed by the storm. He pounded again, shouting Steiner's name. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then he heard the sound of a heavy bar being lifted from inside. The door scraped open a few inches. A sliver of yellow light cut through the gloom. Thorne squinted, expecting to see a scene of desperate misery, and then it hit him. It was not a sight or a sound. It was a physical force, a wave of warmth. A dense, enveloping wave of still, warm air washed over him, carrying the impossible scents of baking bread, roasting meat, and dry seasoned oak. It was the air of a different season, a different world. It struck his frozen face and felt like a summer sun. Steiner pulled the door open wider, and Thorne stared, dumbfounded. Albrecht Steiner was in his shirt sleeves. Behind him, Thorne could see into the main room. It was bathed in the calm, steady glow of 2 oil lamps. There was no roaring, desperate fire. The small iron stove was burning with a low, quiet flame, its door shut tight. Steiner's wife, Anna, was at a wooden table, kneading dough, her own sleeves rolled up past her elbows. She smiled a welcome at him. On the far side of the room, the 2 Steiner children, Karl and Liesel, were playing on the flagstone floor with a set of wooden blocks. They were barefoot. A tortoiseshell cat was not huddled by the fire. It was stretched out languidly in the middle of the room, fast asleep on the warm stones. Thorne stepped inside, and Steiner barred the door behind him, shutting out the raging storm. The silence was as shocking as the warmth. The howling of the wind was gone, replaced by a profound, tomb-like quiet. He looked at the windows. They were not coated in a thick layer of frost. They were clear. He could see the faint reflection of the room in the glass. He was a builder, a man who understood houses in his bones. His mind began to race, trying to process the impossibilities he was witnessing. He walked, almost in a trance, to the north wall, the wall that in his own cabin was a sheet of ice. He reached out a trembling, gloved hand and pressed it against the smooth, fitted stones. He recoiled in shock. It was not just free of frost, it was warm. It was distinctly, undeniably warm to the touch, radiating a gentle, even heat, like a sun-baked rock in late afternoon. He turned and looked at the stove, then back at the wall. It made no sense. The stove was 20 feet away. He looked down at the floor his boots were melting upon. It, too, was warm. Not hot, but a deep, penetrating, uniform warmth that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the house. He finally found his voice, a raw croak. "How?" Steiner gestured to the floor. "The fire warms the stone. The stone warms the house." Thorne shook his head, the pieces beginning to click into place, forming a picture so radical it staggered him. "What is the temperature in here?" he asked. Anna pointed to a small mercury thermometer hanging on a hook near the table. Thorne walked over to it. He had to lean in close to read the small numbers. 66 degrees Fahrenheit. A comfortable room temperature. "And outside?" Thorne whispered. "When I last checked an hour ago," Steiner said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact, "it was 35 degrees below zero." Thorne did the math in his head, and the number stunned him into silence. A 101-degree difference between the inside and the outside. In his own masterpiece cabin, he was struggling to maintain a 35-degree difference. This was impossible. He was looking at a differential nearly 3 times greater. The air in his own home was a frigid 5 degrees. This house was 61 degrees warmer. His eyes darted to the wood box next to the stove. In his home, the wood box was a scene of constant, frantic activity. Here it was a picture of tranquility. It was neat, orderly, and more than 3/4 full. "The wood?" Thorne said, his voice cracking. "How much wood have you burned since the storm began?" Steiner considered the question for a moment. "A few logs yesterday, 3 more this morning, perhaps a dozen in total." A dozen logs. The number was a physical blow. Thorne had burned through nearly 100. He had fed his stove a log every 20 minutes for 2 days straight, a frantic, losing battle. Steiner was using a fraction, perhaps less than 10% of the fuel, and achieving a result that was beyond miraculous. It was a complete inversion of everything Thorne knew about heat and shelter. The numbers were undeniable. They were not a matter of opinion or tradition. They were physics. And they were staring him in the face, embodied by the barefoot children on the floor and the warm stone against his back. He stood in the center of the warm, quiet room for a full minute, the silence broken only by the gentle hiss of the stove and the distant scream of the wind he could no longer feel. He looked at Albrecht Steiner, this quiet immigrant he had dismissed as a fool. He looked at the simple, radical genius of the structure around him. He saw not a tomb, but a sanctuary. He saw the future. Elias Thorne, the most respected builder in the territory, turned to the German stonemason. His voice was thick with humility and awe. "Albrecht," he said, meeting the man's gaze, "I was wrong. I was completely and utterly wrong. When this storm breaks, will you teach me how you did this?" When the blizzard finally ended after 3 days, it left behind a transformed world. The landscape was a silent, sculpted expanse of white. The settlement was half buried, and the community's collective certainty was shattered. The first news to spread was of survival. Then came the stories of hardship, of lost livestock, of families who had nearly frozen in their own homes. And then came the story from Elias Thorne. He did not whisper it. He declared it. He told everyone who would listen about his journey through the storm. He described the wave of warmth, the barefoot children, the full wood box. He spoke of the warm stone walls. He used words like miracle and genius. Coming from any other man, it might have been dismissed as a storm-addled fantasy. Coming from Thorne, it was gospel. The mockery surrounding Steiner's tomb evaporated overnight. It was replaced by a tide of curiosity, then awe. A procession of settlers made their way to the low, snow-covered mound. Steiner, a man who had been a social outcast just a week before, now found himself holding court. He would open his door to his neighbors, and they would step inside, their faces etched with disbelief as they felt the impossible warmth. They would touch the walls. They would stare at the quiet stove. They would ask the same questions Thorne had asked, and Steiner, with infinite patience, would explain the principles. He spoke of the earth as a blanket. He described the stone as a sponge for heat. He explained how the smoke itself was made to work, to pay a tax of warmth to the floor before it was allowed to leave. Thorne became his most fervent student and his most important advocate. He brought his builder's mind to Steiner's principles, translating the mason's art into a language the carpenters could understand. Together, they refined the design. Thorne figured out how to incorporate a wooden inner frame for those less skilled with stone, while still preserving the essential thermal mass and underfloor heating. That spring, a revolution in architecture began on the Dakota Prairie. 3 new families, their confidence bolstered by Thorne's endorsement, chose to build Steiner hearths, as they were now being called. They dug into the earth, hauled fieldstone, and learned the patient art of building for thermal mass. Steiner and Thorne moved between the construction sites, offering advice, correcting mistakes, and supervising the laying of the crucial underfloor channels. Over the next decade, the settlement was visibly transformed. The tall, proud log cabins were still built, but they were increasingly outnumbered by the low, earth-sheltered stone homes. The new standard for survival had been established. The impact was profound. The settlers' relationship with winter changed. It was still a harsh and dangerous season, but the siege had been lifted. The constant, gnawing anxiety about fuel was gone. The winter death toll, especially among the very young and the elderly, plummeted. Albrecht Steiner never sought fame or fortune from his innovation. He remained a quiet stonemason, content to build and to teach. His payment was seeing other families enjoying the same security he had built for his own. His name became synonymous not with a foolish tomb, but with a warm, life-saving hearth. His legacy was not written in books, but in the foundations of the houses that dotted the prairie, and in the quiet comfort of families listening to a blizzard rage outside, safe and warm within walls of stone. The real impact was not measured in degrees on a thermometer or in cords of wood saved. It was measured in human dignity, in the simple, profound luxury of children playing barefoot on a warm floor in the heart of a Dakota winter. What Albrecht Steiner understood was a truth that is both ancient and perpetually rediscovered. He knew that the most elegant solutions are often not about brute force, but about intelligent design. Tradition is not wisdom if it fails the test of reality, and the most stubborn resistance to a new idea often crumbles in the face of undeniable empirical proof. The settlers of the Dakota Territory learned that the earth itself could be an ally against the cold, and that a house could be more than just a shell. It could be a living system, breathing fire, and radiating life. These same principles of thermal mass, passive heat storage, and earth sheltering are alive today. They are the cornerstones of modern passive solar design and high-efficiency homes, ideas that we now see as cutting edge. Yet they were understood perfectly by a humble stonemason over a century ago, a man who listened to the wisdom of the stone and the earth. If this story changed how you think about shelter and survival, hit that like button to let us know. Subscribe for more forgotten wisdom from the frontiers of human ingenuity, and drop a comment below telling us, what is the coldest winter you have ever faced? Stay tuned for our next story, where we'll explore the lost art of building a riverboat engine that could run on whiskey. This presentation is a fictionalized historical narrative created for educational and entertainment purposes, while the engineering and scientific principles discussed, such as thermal mass, earth sheltering, and masonry heaters, are real and historically significant. The specific characters, names, locations, and sequence of events depicted are dramatic inventions. This content does not constitute professional engineering or construction advice.